Industry comes of age 1865 to 1900. The government business entanglements that increasingly shaped politics after the Civil War also undergirded the industrial development of the nation. The outburst of railroad construction was crucial. When Lincoln was shot in 1865, there were 35,000 miles of railways in the United States, mostly east of the Mississippi. By 1900, there were 192,000 miles, much of it west of the Mississippi. The transcontinental railroad building was so expensive and risky that it required government subsidies. Construction of railway systems promised greater national unity and economic growth. Railroads Worldwide 1889. Another calculation of railway track per 10,000 inhabitants in 1904 revealed that the United States was still far out in front with 26.4 miles of track compared to 15.2 miles for the second-place country, Sweden. Much further behind were the major Western European nations of France, Germany, and Great Britain and Ireland. Arguments for military and postal needs impressed Congress to advance liberal loans to two favored cross-continental companies in 1862. Congress added enormous donations of acreage paralleling the tracks. Washington granted railroads 155 million acres, and western states contributed another 49 million for a total area larger than Texas. Land grants were given in broad belts along the proposed railroad route. Within these belts, railroads could choose alternate mile square sections in checkerboard fashion. Until the determination of the precise route for tracks, railroads withheld all land from other uses. President Cleveland put an end to this foot-dragging practice in 1887 and threw open to settlement the still unclaimed public portions of the land grant areas. Government benefited by receiving preferential rail rates for postal service and military traffic. Granting land was also a cheap way to subsidize a much-desired transportation system because it avoided new taxes for direct cash payments. Railroads could turn land into gold by using it as collateral for loans from private bankers. This they did by selling it at an average price of $3 an acre. Critics overlooked that the land had a relatively modest value until railroads had ribboned it with steel. Frontier villages along the route flourished into cities. Those bypassed became ghost towns. Ambitious towns held out monetary incentives to the builders, who sometimes blackmailed them into contributing more generously. In 1862, Congress started the long-awaited line. An argument for action was the urgency of bolstering the Union. By binding the Pacific Coast, especially gold-rich California, there would be more security with the rest of the Republic. The Union Pacific Railroad, note the word Union, thrust westward from Omaha. For each mile of track constructed, the company was granted 20 square miles of land, alternating in 640-acre sections on either side of the track. For each mile, builders were given generous federal loans, from $16,000 on flat land to $48,000 for mountainous country. Laying of rails began in earnest after the Civil War. The Credit Mobilier Construction Company, that reaped fabulous profits, pocketed $73 million for $50 million worth of breakneck construction. They bribed congressmen to look the other way. The construction work was done with sweaty construction gangs. Irish paddies worked at a frantic pace. When Indians, whose land was seized, would attack, workers would use their rifles. Scores of people died. At the end of the tracks, workers tried to find relaxation in tented towns. The Central Pacific Railroad pushed east from Boomtown, Sacramento through the towering snow-clogged Sierra Nevadas. Four far-seeing men, the Big Four, were the chief financial backers of the enterprise. Ex-Governor Leland Stanford of California used his political connections. Collis P. Huntington was an adept lobbyist. The Big Four operated two construction companies, pocketed tens of millions in profits, kept their hands clean from bribes, and were granted the same princely subsidies as the Union Pacific. But they had the same incentive to move quickly and used 10,000 Chinese laborers who sweated from dawn to dusk. These workers proved to be cheap, efficient, and expendable. Over the Sierra Nevadas, they gained only a few inches each day, tunneling through solid rock, while those sledge-hammering westward crossed the open plains. Wedding of the Rails consummated near Ogden, Utah, 1869, with colorful ceremony. Union Pacific built 1,086 miles, the Central Pacific 689 miles. Snow sheds on the Central Pacific Railroad in the Sierra Nevada mountains by Joseph H. Becker, circa 1869. Formidable obstacles of climate and terrain confronted the builders of the Central Pacific Railroad in the mountainous heights of California. Note the Chinese laborers in the foreground. The results of railroad construction were that it was one of America's most impressive peacetime undertakings. It welded the West Coast more firmly to the Union and facilitated the flourishing trade with Asia. The railroad penetrated the arid barriers of deserts, paving the way for the phenomenal growth of the Great West. Promoting the Union Pacific Railroad, 1869. 4 other transcontinental railroads were completed. None secured monetary loans from the government. All, except the Great Northern, received generous grants of land. The Northern Pacific, from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, was finished in 1883. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line from the Southwest deserts to California was finished in 1884. The Southern Pacific, from New Orleans to San Francisco, was consolidated in 1884. The Great Northern Railroad from Duluth to Seattle was finished in 1893. It was the creation of the far-visioned Canadian-American James Hill, probably the greatest railroad builder. His enterprise was so soundly organized, it rode through later financial storms with flying colors. Pioneer builders were often over-optimistic and sometimes laid rails from nowhere to nothing. There were endless bankruptcies, mergers, and reorganizations. Western lines were facilitated by the welding and expanding of older Eastern networks, notably the New York Central. Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt amassed a fortune of $100 million by offering superior service at lower rates. Railroads also pushed from the switch from iron to steel rails. Eastern networks moved to a standard gauge track. The Westinghouse air brake increased safety. Pullman Palace cars were also introduced. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Link at Promontory Point, Utah, May 10, 1869. Railroad financiers, dignitaries, spectators, and Chinese from the Central Pacific and Irish from the Union Pacific work gangs witnessed the historic joining that created the nation's first transcontinental railroad. After the two locomotives chugged within a few feet of each other, the Central Pacific chief and former California Governor Leland Stanford tapped a golden spike into a prepared hole on the last tie with a silver-plated maul. The golden spike was whisked away to be preserved for posterity at the Stanford University Museum. But the iron one that replaced it was hardly ordinary. It was wired to a Union Pacific telegraph line, while a copper plate on the mall was connected to a Central Pacific wire. When they touched, they closed a telegraphic circuit that sent the news to cities all over the country. Railroads intimately touched countless phases of American life. For the first time, the sprawling nation united in the physical sense, bound with ribs of iron and steel. It became America's biggest industry, employed more people than any other industry. It gobbled up nearly 20% of investment dollars from foreign and domestic investors. It spurred the amazing economic growth of the post-Civil War period. It opened the West with all its wealth of resources and made America the largest integrated national market in the world. It generated the largest single source of orders for the adolescent steel industry and stimulated mining and agriculture in the West. Clusters of farm settlements paralleled the railroads. Railways were a boon to cities. They led the great cityward movement of the late 1800s and stimulated a mighty stream of immigration. The land also felt the impact. America had an especially broad and ecologically fragile midsection. Settlers plowed up the tall grass prairies and planted well-drained rectangular cornfields. Range-fed cattle displaced the buffalo, and they were hunted to near extinction. White pine forests disappeared into lumber to build houses and fences. Time itself was bent to the railroad's needs. Until the 1880s, each town had its own local time. But on November 18, 1883, the major rail lines decreed that the continent would be divided into 4 time zones. Most communities adopted the standard time. Railroads made millionaires out of the colossal wealth amassed by stock speculators and railroad wreckers. Corruption lurks when fortunes can be made overnight. Jay Gould was the most adept ringmaster of rapacity. For years he boomed and busted stocks of major railroad companies by means of speculation. Stockwatering made cattle thirsty by feeding them salt and bloating them with water before weighing them for sale. Using the same method, stock promoters inflated claims about a rail line's assets and profitability to sell stocks and bonds far in excess of their actual value. Railroads were forced to charge extortionate rates and wage competitive battles to pay off their financial obligations. The public interest was trampled by railroad titans who waged brutal wars. Railroaders blandly bought and sold people. They bribed judges and legislatures, employed arm-twisting lobbyists, elected their own creatures to high offices, and showered free passes on journalists and politicians in the West. For a time, they were virtual industrial monarchs. These industrial monarchs manipulated a huge national monopoly. They exercised more direct control over the people than the president, with no limit to 4-year terms. Eventually, they moved from cutthroat competition to cooperation. They entered into defensive alliances to protect profits. An early form of combination was the pool, where they agreed to divide the business in a given area and share the profits. They granted rebates or kickbacks to large shippers and slashed rates on competing lines, while they made up the difference on non-competing lines. The result was that small farmers paid higher rates than large shippers. The American people were quick to respond to political injustice, but slow to combat economic injustice. Americans were dedicated to free enterprise and the principle that competition is the soul of trade. There was a cherished pride in progress. They remembered Jefferson's hostility to government interference with business. Above all, the American dream was the hope that in the catch-as-catch-can economic system, anyone might become a millionaire. William H. Vanderbilt, robber baron. This 1885 cartoon takes aim at Vanderbilt's notorious comment, "The public be damned." The Depression of the 1870s goaded farmers into protesting against being railroaded into bankruptcy. Under pressure from organized agrarian groups like the Grange, or Patrons of Husbandry, many Midwestern legislatures tried to regulate the railroads, but the efforts were stopped in Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railroad Company versus Illinois in 1886. The Supreme Court decreed that individual states had no power to regulate interstate commerce. If the mechanical monster was to be corralled, the federal government would have to do it. Cleveland did not look kindly on effective regulation. The epochal Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 prohibited rebates and pools, required railroads to publish rates openly, forbade unfair discrimination against shippers, and outlawed charging more for short hauls than long ones over the same line. And most important, set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, to administer and enforce the law. Despite its acclaim, the ICC Act did not represent a popular victory over corporate wealth. What the ICC legislation did do was provide an orderly forum where competing business interests could resolve conflicts in peaceable ways. The ICC Act tended to stabilize, not revolutionize, the existing business system. The Act still ranks as a red-letter law. It was the first large-scale attempt by Washington to regulate business in the interest of society at large. It heralded the arrival of independent regulatory commissions which commit the government to monitoring the private economy to protect the public interest. There was a post-war industrial expansion. In 1860, the Republic was ranked fourth in the world, but by 1894, the Republic was ranked first. The sudden upsurge was due to liquid capital. While once scarce, it was now abundant. The word millionaire had not been coined until the 1840s, and in 1861 there were only a handful of them. But Civil War profiteering created huge fortunes, and that, combined with investments from foreign capitalists, created many more millionaires. In the post-1865 period, there was massive foreign investment in the USA. Most foreign investment went to private ventures, not public coffers. Investors from Britain, followed by France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, owned all or part of American businesses. Or they lent money to European companies that invested in U.S. industries. Either way, Europeans were content to let Americans run their own businesses until hard times hit. Then they demanded more say over company operations or government policies. Innovations in transportation fueled growth, which brought the nation's abundant resources of coal, oil, iron to the factory door. Shipping through the Great Lakes carried rich iron deposits of the Mesabi Range from Minnesota to Chicago and Cleveland for refining. This priceless bonanza became the cornerstone of the vast steel empire. Copper, bauxite, and zinc made similar journeys from the mine to manufacture. The sheer size of the American market encouraged innovators to invent mass production methods. Anyone who could make an appealing new product in large quantities and figure out how to market it thrived. Industrials continued to refine the pre-Civil War American system of using specialized machinery to make interchangeable parts, culminating in Henry Ford's fully moving assembly line for the Model T. Captains of industry had major incentives to invent machines. They replaced expensive skilled labor with cheap unskilled workers. Unskilled workers were plentiful because of massive immigration. Brilliant ideas gave rise to whole new businesses. Between 1860 and 1890, some 440,000 patents were issued. Business operations were facilitated by the cash register, the stock ticker, and the typewriter. The refrigerator car, the electric dynamo, and the electric railway speeded urbanization. One of the most ingenious inventions was the telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. It created a gigantic communication network. It had a huge social impact when the lure of "number please" took women away from the stove to the switchboard. The most versatile inventor was Thomas Alva Edison, whose life spanned from 1847 to 1931. Severe deafness enabled him to concentrate without distraction. He was a gifted tinkerer and tireless worker, not a pure scientist. Wondrous devices poured out of his invention factory in New Jersey: the phonograph, the mimeograph, the dictaphone, and the moving picture. He was best known for his perfection of the electric light bulb in 1879. It turned night into day and transformed human habits. People who slept an average of 9 hours a night now slept just a bit more than 7. Thomas Alva Edison in his lab, 1888. Edison was dubbed the Wizard of Menlo Park, New Jersey, where he lived and established the first major industrial research laboratory. Edison was not only an ingenious inventor, but he also figured out how to apply the principles of mass production to his inventions. Phonographs, telephones, telegraphs, incandescent electric lighting, fluoroscopes, kinetoscopes, and many more technological wonders spread throughout the world following their development in Edison's lab. Most business leaders devised ways to circumvent the competition. Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, integrated every phase of steel making into one operation. His miners scratched ore from the Mesabi Range. His ships floated it across the Great Lakes. His railroads delivered it to factories at Pittsburgh, and no other hands had touched it when the metal poured into the waiting ingot molds. Carnegie pioneered the creative entrepreneurial tactic of vertical integration, which combines into one organization all phases of manufacturing, from mining to marketing. The goal was to improve efficiency by making supplies more reliable, control product quality at all stages of production, and eliminate the middleman's fees. John D. Rockefeller mastered the technique of horizontal integration, allying with competitors to monopolize a market. He perfected a device for controlling his rivals, the trust. Stockholders in small oil companies assigned their stock to the board of directors of Standard Oil Company. Standard Oil then consolidated the operations of the previously competing enterprises. Ruthlessly wielding vast power, Standard Oil cornered virtually the entire world petroleum market. He inspired many imitators, and the word trust was used to describe any large-scale business combination. J. Piermont Morgan devised other schemes to eliminate wasteful competition. The Depression of the 1890s drove many businessmen, led by cutthroat competition, to Morgan. His remedy was to consolidate rival enterprises. He placed officers of his own banking syndicate on various boards of directors, known as interlocking directorates. The Octopus, 1904. This cartoon visually captures a feeling of widespread resentment against Standard Oil as a powerful, sprawling octopus whose tentacles controlled all branches of government. Steel is king might well have been the war cry of this new generation. This was a new steel civilization, built with steel from skyscrapers to coal shuttles. Steel making, especially rails for railroads, typified the dominance of heavy industry, with a concentration on capital goods as opposed to consumer goods such as clothes and other personal items. Steel was expensive in the 1860s and 1870s. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, the famous railroad magnate of the 1870s, was forced to import steel rails from Britain. By 1900, the USA outdistanced all foreign competitors, making more than 1/3 of the world's steel. What wrought this transformation? The Bessemer process. It was invented in the 1850s and was a method of making cheap steel. It was named after a British inventor, but the process was discovered first by an American named William Kelly a few years earlier. Kelly, a Kentucky manufacturer of iron kettles, developed an air-blowing technique on red-hot iron. Gradually, the Bessemer-Kelly process was accepted. Eventually, the two crazy men made the present steel civilization possible. Andrew Carnegie was the kingpin of the steel masters. He was a gifted organizer and administrator. He succeeded by picking high-class associates and by eliminating many middlemen. His partnership involved about 40 Pittsburgh millionaires. By 1900, he produced 1/4 of the nation's Bessemer steel. His partners in the pre-income tax days divided the profits of $40 million a year as take-home pay. The Napoleon of the smokestacks received $25 million. J. Pierpont Morgan was a financial giant. He financed the reorganization of railroads, insurance companies, and banks. He claimed that money power was not dangerous except in dangerous hands, and he did not regard his own hands as dangerous. Circumstances brought Morgan and Carnegie into a collision. By 1900, Carnegie was ready to sell his holdings. Morgan, meanwhile, plunged heavily into the manufacture of steel pipe tubing. Carnegie threatened to enter the same business if Morgan did not meet his price. Carnegie's agents haggled with Morgan for 8 hours until he agreed to buy Carnegie out for over $400 million. Carnegie, fearing he would die disgraced with so much wealth, dedicated his remaining years to giving away the money to public libraries, pensions for professors, and other philanthropic purposes. He gave away about $350 million. Morgan moved rapidly to expand his new industrial empire. He took Carnegie Holdings, added others, watered the stock liberally, and in 1901 launched an enlarged United States Steel Corporation. It was capitalized at $1.4 billion, America's first billion-dollar corporation. It was a larger sum than the total wealth of the nation in 1800. The Industrial Revolution had come into its own. J.P. Morgan, 1837 to 1913. As the most influential banker of his day, Morgan symbolized to many people the power and arrogance of financial capitalism. The chronic skin disorder on his nose inspired the taunt, "Johnny Morgan's nasal organ has a purple hue." The emergence of the oil industry was one of the most striking developments before and after the Civil War. In 1859, the first well in Pennsylvania, Drake's Folly, poured out liquid black gold. Kerosene, derived from petroleum, was the first major product of the infant oil industry. The oil industry soon boomed. By the 1870s, kerosene was America's fourth most valuable product. But what technology gives, technology takes away. In 1885, 250,000 of Edison's electric light bulbs were in use. In 1900, 15 million. The new light bulbs rendered kerosene obsolete, just as kerosene had rendered whale oil obsolete. Oil might have remained a shrinking industry, but for the invention of the automobile. By 1900, the gasoline-burning internal combustion engine surpassed rivals steam and electricity as the superior means of automobile propulsion. The automobile age gave the oil business a new, long-lasting, and hugely profitable lease on life. Rockefeller came to dominate the oil industry. In 1870, he organized the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, which became the nucleus of the Great Trust formed in 1882. Locating his refineries in Cleveland, he eliminated middlemen and squeezed out competitors. Rockefeller flourished in an age of completely free enterprise. He operated just to the windward of the law. He pursued a policy of rule or ruin. By 1877, he controlled 95% of all oil refineries in the United States. Rockefeller, or Reckafellow as Carnegie once called him, showed little mercy. Rockefeller's oil monopoly did turn out superior product at a relatively cheap price. He also achieved important economies by its large-scale methods of production and distribution and the efficient use of expensive machinery, and consolidation proved more profitable than ruinous price wars. Washington as seen by the trusts, 1900. What a funny little government, John D. Rockefeller observes in his satirical cartoon. His own wealth and power are presumed to dwarf the resources of the federal government. Other trusts blossomed in sugar, tobacco, and leather. The Harvester Trust amalgamated 200 competitors. The meat industry arose on western herds, and there emerged kings Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour. Untrusty trusts and the pirates who captained them created a disturbingly new, arrogant class of the new rich, who elbowed aside the traditional patrician families. Robber Baron Cyrus Field, Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Russell Sage kept afloat on the broken backs of America's workingmen, 1883. The rich credited heavenly help for their wealth. "The good Lord gave me my money," Rockefeller was quoted as saying. The wealthy were entrusted with society's riches, and therefore had to prove themselves morally responsible according to the gospel of wealth, said Carnegie. Most defenders of capitalism relied on the survival of the fittest theories of Herbert Spencer and William Graham. Social Darwinists argued individuals won their stations in life by competing on the basis of their natural talents. Evolutionary proponents Spencer and Sumner likened to Charles Darwin, who stressed the adaptations of organisms. However, their notions were based less on science and more on the British laissez-faire economists David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus. It was Spencer, not Darwin, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. The millionaires are a product of natural selection, said Sumner. The self-justification by the wealthy involved the contempt for the poor. The Reverend Russell Conwell became rich by delivering a lecture, Acres of Diamonds, thousands of times. The plutocracy took its stand on the Constitution, the clause that gave Congress sole jurisdiction over interstate commerce was a godsend to monopolists. Giant trusts also sought refuge behind the 14th Amendment. Courts ingenuously interpreted a corporation to be a legal person. Therefore, it cannot be deprived of its property by a state without due process of law. Giant industrialists incorporated in easy states like New Jersey, where restrictions on big business was mild or non-existent. Masses of people began to monopolize against the monopoly. At first, they tried to control trusts through state legislatures. After that failure, they were forced to appeal to Congress. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 forbade combinations in restraint of trade without any distinction between good trusts and bad trusts. Bigness, not badness, was sin. The law proved ineffective, largely because it contained legal loopholes. They were ineffective in one respect. Contrary to the original intent, they were used to curb labor unions or labor combinations deemed to be restraining trade. The prosecution of trusts under the Sherman Act of 1890 was neither vigorous nor successful. More trusts were formed in the 1890s than at any other time period. Only after 1914 were paper jaws added to the Sherman Act. Still, the iron grip of monopolistic corporations threatened. New principles were written into law by the Sherman Antitrust Act as well as by the Interstate Commerce Act. Private greed should be subordinated to public need. Economic conditions of the South were difficult. In 1900, the South produced a smaller percentage of U.S. manufactured goods than it had before the Civil War. The plantation system degenerated into a pattern of absentee land ownership. White and black sharecroppers tilled the soil for a share of the crop or became tenants in bondage to landlords who controlled the needed credit and supplies. Southern agriculture was boosted when machine-made cigarettes replaced the roll-your-own variety and consumption increased. James Buchanan Duke used new technology to mass-produce the so-called coffin nails. In 1890, he absorbed his main competitors into the American Tobacco Company. He later showed such generosity to Trinity College in Durham, North Carolina, that the trustees changed its name to Duke University. The new rich and the new immigrants. A well-to-do family plays chess at its parlor left, while a tenement family does piecework around its kitchen table, shelling nuts for commercial use right. The young working girl seems to be snitching some nuts for herself. The apparently growing gulf between the rich and the poor deeply worried reformers in the late 19th century. They feared that democracy could not survive in the face of such gross inequality. A Virginia tobacco factory, circa 1899. The employment of women and children was a common practice in the late 19th century American industry, north as well as south. The South remained overwhelmingly rural. The New South booster was Henry W. Grady, editor of the Atlanta Constitution. He exhorted ex-Confederates to become Georgia Yankees and outplay the North at commerce and industry. There were obstacles in the path of Southern industrialization, however. There were regional rate-setting systems imposed by Northern-dominated railroad interests. The railroads gave preferential rates to manufactured goods moving southward from the north. In the opposite direction, they discriminated in favor of Southern raw materials. The net effect kept the South in servitude to the Northeast. For example, the Pittsburgh Plus pricing system in the steel industry, which, with the complicity of the railroads, placed a fee upon Southern steel. In manufacturing cotton textiles, the South fared better. Textile mills proved to be a mixed blessing to the economically blighted South. Cheap labor was the South's major attraction for investors. Keeping labor cheap became almost a religion among Southern industrialists. Mills took root in the chronically depressed Piedmont region of Southern Appalachia. White rural Southerners sought employment in company mill towns. Entire families of hillbillies or lintheads worked from dawn to dusk. They were paid half the rate of their Southern counterparts. Often, they received compensation in the form of credit at the company store, to which they were habitually in debt. Many saw employment in the mills as salvation for their destitute farm families. Cotton manufacturing moved south 1880 to 1980. Textile manufacturing usually looms large in the early stages of industrial development. In the later stages, it gives way to higher technology businesses. This can be seen here, both in the migration of textile manufacturing to the southern United States and in the decline in the number of spindles in the United States as a whole since the 1930s, as the developing third world countries became major textile producers. World cotton production, 1903. Cotton manufacturing grew in the United States in the early 20th century, and raw cotton production reached higher levels than anywhere else in the world. Women canning shrimp, 1893. Long hours, low pay, and wretched working conditions were the common fate of women who labored not for pin money, but to help support their families. The family wage for the working man was more a hope than a reality. Economic miracles. The standards of living rose sharply, and U.S. workers enjoyed more physical comforts than in other industrial nations. Cities mushroomed as factories demanded more labor, and more immigrants arrived seeking jobs. Federal authority was now committed to decades of corporation curbing and trust busting. The very concept of time was revolutionized, not by the clock of nature, but by the factory whistle. The most affected group was women. Propelled into industry by new inventions, they discovered new economic and social opportunities. The Gibson Girl, created by Charles Dana Gibson, showed an independent and athletic new woman. Most women workers toiled neither for independence nor for glamour, but out of economic necessity. They faced long hours and dangerous conditions, as did their mates and brothers. They earned less as wages for women's jobs usually were set below those for men's jobs. The machine age accentuated class division. The industrial buccaneers flaunted their bloated fortunes. Spouses displayed glittering diamonds. Such extravagances evoked bitter criticism. Some of it was envy. Much arose from socialists and other radicals, some from recent European immigrants. The oligarchy of money was demonstrated by the fact that in 1900, about 10% of people owned 90% of the nation's wealth. A nation of farmers and independent producers became a nation of wage earners. In 1860, half of all workers were self-employed. By 1900, 2 of every 3 working Americans depending on wages. With independence on wages came vulnerability to swings of the economy and whims of the employer. Fear of unemployment were constant. Reformers struggled to introduce a measure of security, job and wage protection, provision for temporary unemployment into lives of workers. Strong pressures for increased foreign trade developed. Factories saturated the domestic market. International trade became cheaper, faster, and easier. Flag follows trade, and empire tends to follow flag, a lesson America would soon learn. Golfing Gibson girls. The image of the so-called Gibson girl, healthy, athletic, and confident, was hardly confined to the pen of its creator, illustrator Charles Dana Gibson. Other turn-of-the-century artists also depicted such modern women, including Walter Granville Smith in this 1900 painting of a golf outing. The Gibson girl ideal inspired new standards of female fashion as the 20th century opened, and came to symbolize women's growing independence and assertiveness. Workers did not share proportionately with employers. Workers became a mere lever puller in a giant mechanism. Individual originality and creativity was stifled. Less value was placed on manual labor. Now, factory hands were employed by a corporation, depersonalized, bodiless, soulless, and often conscienceless. Directors did not know individual workers, and in fairness to the stockholders, were not inclined to engage in large-scale private philanthropy. New machines displaced employees. In the long run, more jobs were created, but the glutted market severely handicapped wage earners. Individual workers were powerless to battle single-handedly giant corporations. Corporations could dispense with an individual worker much more easily than a worker could dispense with a corporation. Employers could pool vast wealth through thousands of stockholders. They retained high-priced lawyers, bought up the local press, put pressure on politicians, imported strikebreakers known as scabs, and employed thugs to beat up labor organizers. Corporations had other weapons too. They could call on the federal courts to issue injunctions ordering strikers to cease striking, and if a defiance and disorder ensued, the company could request state and federal authorities to send in troops. Employers could lock the doors against rebellious workers, called a lockout, and starve workers into submission. They could also compel workers to sign ironclad oaths or yellow dog contracts, which were solemn agreements not to join labor unions. They put the names of agitators on blacklists and circulated it among their fellow employers. Often workers sank into perpetual debt to company stores. The middle class were annoyed by strikes, and they grew deaf to the outcry of workers. The strike seemed foreign and socialistic, and hence unpatriotic. Big business might combine into trusts to raise prices, but workers must not combine into unions to raise wages. The Strike by Robert Kohler, 1886. Scenes like these were becoming more typical of American life in the late 19th century as industrialism advanced spectacularly and sometimes ruthlessly. Here, Kohler shows an entire community of men, women, and children, many of them apparently immigrant newcomers, challenging the power of the boss. The scene is tense but orderly, though violence seems to be imminent as one striker reaches for a rock. Labor unions were boosted by the Civil War. Loss of human life drained off the labor supply. The mounting cost of living provided an incentive to unionize. By 1872, several 100,000 workers had organized. 32 national unions representing such crafts as bricklayers, typesetters, and shoemakers. Breaker Boys at South Pittston, Pennsylvania, 1911. Photographer Lewis Hine captured the grimness of these mine helpers' lives. For hours they sat on benches above a moving belt, breathing coal dust deep into their lungs, and kicking large pieces of coal with their feet, breaking the lumps to uniform size for shipment. Photographs like this one became icons of the Reform Crusade against child labor, a campaign that succeeded only with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. The National Labor Union, organized in 1866, represented a large boot stride by workers. It was one of the first national-scale unions to form and was aimed to unify workers across locales and trades to challenge the ever more powerful employers. It lasted 6 years and attracted an impressive total of some 600,000 members, including skilled and unskilled and farmers. It excluded the Chinese and made only nominal efforts to include women and blacks. The Colored National Labor Union gave their support for the Republican Party, and the persistent racism of white unionists prevented the two national unions from working together. The National Labor Union called for arbitration of industrial disputes, an 8-hour workday, winning the latter for government workers. The Union was crippled by the Depression of the 1870s. The Knights of Labor seized the torch dropped by the National Labor Union. It officially was known as the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. It began in 1869 as a secret society with a private ritual, passwords, and a special handshake. Its secrecy, which continued until 1881, forestalled reprisals by employers. They sought to include all workers in one big union. They included skilled and unskilled, whites and blacks, men and women. They sought only to bar non-producers, liquor dealers, and professional gamblers, lawyers, bankers, and stockbrokers. They refused to enter politics and campaigned for economic and social reform, including producers' cooperative codes for safety and health. They frowned on industrial warfare while fostering industrial arbitration. The ordinary workday was 10 or more hours a day, so the Knights of Labor waged a determined campaign for 8 hours instead. Under the leadership of Terence V. Powderly, they won a number of strikes for the 8-hour workday after the Knights staged a successful strike against Jay Gould's Wabash Railroad in 1885. Membership mushroomed to about 750,000 people. Unions got involved in a number of May Day strikes in 1886. About half of them failed. The focal point was in Chicago with 80,000 Knights. In the Haymarket Square episode, labor disputes had broken out. On May 4, 1886, police advanced on a meeting which was called to protest alleged brutalities by the authorities. Suddenly, a bomb was thrown, killing or injuring several dozen people, including police. Hysteria swept Chicago, and 8 anarchists were arrested because they preached incendiary ideas. They were charged with conspiracy. 5 were sentenced to death. The other 3 were given stiff prison terms. Agitation for clemency mounted. John Altgeld was elected governor in 1892, and after Altgeld studied the Haymarket case exhaustively, he pardoned 3 survivors. Violent abuse was showered on Altgeld by conservatives, while he was also praised by those who thought the men innocent. Altgeld was defeated for re-election. The Haymarket Square bomb helped blow the props from under the Knights of Labor. They had been associated with the anarchists, and their strikes met with scant success. Another fatal handicap of the Knights was the inclusion of skilled and unskilled workers. Unskilled labor could easily be replaced by scabs. Craft unionists couldn't be replaced so readily. Hence, they enjoyed a better bargaining position. Skilled workers sought refuge in the American Federation of Labor, a federation of exclusively skilled craft unions. Desertion of skilled craft unionists dealt the Knights a body blow. By the 1890s, they were down to only 100,000 members who gradually fused with other protest groups. Machinist Frank J. Farrell, black delegate of the District Assembly No. 49, introducing the General Master Workman Terence Powderly to the 10th Annual Convention of the Knights of Labor, held in Richmond, Virginia, 1886. Women delegates to the 1886 Convention of the Knights of Labor. The elitist American Federation of Labor was established in 1886 and was largely the brainchild of Samuel Gompers. He had been a cigar maker. He was elected president of the AF-of-L every year except one from 1886 to 1924. The American Federation of Labor was a federation, an association of self-governing national unions, each independent with the AF-of-L as a unifying overall strategy. No individual laborer could join the central organization. Gompers adopted a down-to-earth approach. He soft-pedaled attempts to engineer sweeping social reform. He was a bitter foe of socialism, and he shunned politics for economic strategies and goals. He had no quarrel with capitalism. He just demanded a fairer share for labor. All he wanted, he said, was more. He promoted what he called pure and simple unionism, better wages, hours, and working conditions. One of his major goals was the trade agreement authorizing the closed shop, or an all-union labor. His chief weapons were the walkout and the boycott. The AF-of-L was established on solid but narrow ground. It fell short of representing all workers. It was composed of skilled craftsmen, carpenters, and bricklayers, but left unskilled laborers, including women and blacks, to fend for themselves. it weathered the Panic of 1893. By 1900, it had a membership of 500,000 people. Critics refer to it with questionable accuracy as the Labor Trust. Labor disorders continued. More than 23,000 strikes occurred between 1881 and 1900. Disturbances involved 6,600,000 workers, with the total loss to employers and employees of $450 million. Strikers lost about half of their strikes and won or compromised the remainder. The gravest weakness of organized labor was that it embraced only a small minority of all working people, about 3% in 1900. But the public attitude toward labor was changing. The public conceded the right of workers to organize and to bargain collectively and to strike. Labor Day was made a holiday by Congress in 1894. A few industrialists saw the wisdom of bargaining with unions to avoid strikes, but the vast majority of employers continued to fight organized labor. Nothing was handed to unions on a silver platter. Still, it was some time before labor unions gained a position of relative equality with capital. If the age of big business had dawned, the age of big labor still had some distance over the horizon.